Thank you for being here, Mark. As you know, this interview is part of the SPokenWeb project, which is like a digital poetry archive. And what I'm interested in, what the project is interested in doing, is sort of investigating the technology that also brought this poetry series to life. So we have all these leftover reel-to-reel tapes, and we want to find out sort of how they came to be there so that we could hear and listen to this poetry right now. So that's why we've asked you to share your recollections. You were the coordinator of technical operations at Sir George Williams University in the instructional media office and the other audiovisual departments that followed. And so just really excited to hear about your recollections from that time. So I thought we'd start off, maybe you could tell us how you came to find yourself working at the instructional media office, and then we can move into more of the poetry readings and recordings.
In 1968, I arrived in Canada to marry my wife, who I'd met in London. She'd moved to travel around and to work and so on. My background, I worked for the BBC in London for 4 years, and I started off in the technical services and then gradually moved into the production, mostly in radio. Although in London we were also responsible for television sound and so forth. So I had a strong background in broadcasting. When I came to London, when I came to Montreal, the options were to go into broadcasting, but I didn't find that particularly exciting. The small stations were basically talk radio, and CBC was really concerned more with trying to get the signal around the country than doing any really innovative programming. It was a bad time to arrive in Montreal. Expo had just finished, so there weren't many job opportunities. But having this edge, I applied to both McGill and Sir George Williams, and both of them had just started their audiovisual services and were looking at such things as incorporating technology into teaching. And the whole building had just opened the year before, and that was an extremely innovative building. It was a wired building, and as a result they were looking for staff who had some knowledge of production and the application of television and audio in supporting teaching. So it was a nice fit. So I arrived here in the spring of '68, and as a technician, in fact, which didn't last very long. I became the supervisor of technical services section, and then moved over to technical operations, really based on my experience in the BBC of how to organize support services.
Right. So what was your earliest when did you first hear about the poetry readings or the poetry series in connection with your positions?
Well, I guess that was pretty well from the beginning, because that was an event that was very complex, because they were generally held in open public spaces. That was either the cafeteria, I think, was the most used space. Not the cafeteria as such, but in those days the 7th floor of the whole building had both cafeteria and recreational space. It had ping pong tables and that sort of thing, and lounges. So put a natural space for a poetry reading where you could have a fairly informal setting of chairs and so on. And also, of course, it was in the evening, and Sir George Williams was primarily an evening school, so there really wasn't any academic space available anyway. So it was a good setting.
Right. And so I've heard from Nick Ostapkevich, who I think he participated in some of the recordings prior to '68. He worked in the learning labs, the language labs in the drama building as a student. And so at that time, the reel-to-reel machine that belonged to the language labs, I guess, was moved back and forth and to the galleries or to the cafeteria.
It was not used for that long. It was a Ewer Report L. It had 5-inch reels, came with its own microphone, and was standard issue to broadcasters. With a 5-inch reel you had half an hour at max at the lowest speed. If you wanted any decent quality you had 15 minutes, because it was really designed for the broadcast industry. So that wasn't a great choice. Pretty soon after the move to the whole building, we were able to use the machine that they had in a rack there, which was primarily intended to make 4-track language tapes for mounting on a seriously wild piece of technology that allowed you to dial up your language programs. And these were reel-to-reel decks with 4 exercises recorded on each tape, but you needed a 4-track recorder to do that. And it was a Crown 800, I think.
Okay. So at this point, it wasn't done in a mobile way?
Yes, yeah,
Oh, it still was.
We took the Crown out of its rack.
Okay.
And we mounted it in a trolley.
Okay.
And then it could be moved around. Besides doing the poetry readings, it was used for the early music recordings under the music department and any other productions that we needed a mobile recorder for.
Okay.
Later on, I had a Revox 36 of my own, and in fact, that got brought into use as well. It was a bit more compact than the...
For poetry readings, do you recall?
I think it was used for some of those,
okay.
yes. Yes, it became a floating machine that went between the sound studios and other mobile use.
Right. And who was trained in doing that? Did you do it yourself, or was there a range of people, or how did that break down?
The audiovisual services had a very minimal staff. That sounded like a lot of people, but when I was the director, we actually had 35 full-time staff. But they worked in 10 different sections within the AV services.
Okay.
We had almost between 75 and 100 part-time workers. They were students working on a part-time basis. Fortunately, with a very strong technical program, CUTV, or before that it was known as SGWU, there were a lot of really enthusiastic students who knew a fair bit about technology. And that was our main source of labor.
Okay.
So primarily the poetry readings were actually recorded by students,
Interesting.
trained by us, but the setups were generally done by the full-time staff, because they were very often very different.
Right.
And they were in often very awkward,
Okay.
well, awkward, but certainly premises not suited for that or not set up for that. So everything had to be portable.
So if I'm understanding right, so setups were done by full-time staff, and then students came in to do
The students
recording
were
later?
generally involved in the setup as well.
Oh, okay.
But that was part of it.
Team.
But they had advice from
Yeah.
and help from the full-time as well.
Can you kind of describe, or just sort of choose one from your recollection and kind of just describe what you went through to bring what you brought, whether you did something earlier in the day or had a sound check?
Well, the cafeteria was actually also very advanced in its concept, but in its technical execution it left a great deal to be desired. The sound system was set up to cover the entire cafeteria, but it was also designed to be chopped up into sections so that you could divide the place up and have different sounds in different spaces. So the lounge area where the poetry readings were held could be separated from the main feed for the cafeteria, which was generally a feed from Radio Sir George.
Okay.
That sort of chunked along all day. The cafeteria had mic sockets in the walls, and they were unusual. They had 4 pins. Most professional mics have 3 pins. The 4th pin operated a relay so that when you plugged the mic in, it cut off the speakers in the immediate vicinity of the microphone.
Okay.
This was to stop feedback. In those days, you didn't have the kind of sophisticated PA that you have today with anti-feedback, and we didn't have the cardioid directional microphones that we have today.
This is all new details to me.
Well, the directional microphones, as opposed to a straightforward omnidirectional mic. The EV635A was the standard broadcast interview mic of the day, but it was omnidirectional, so it picked everything up.
Okay.
Later on, you got microphones which had a directional pattern. In fact, most microphones used today are directional. So there were technical limitations. The cafeteria system didn't work that well for a number of reasons. So in fact, we had to then go out and went out and put together a mobile setup. And we didn't have any money to do this sort of thing. A huge amount of money had been spent on putting the permanent installations into the hall building. There was no money for mobile equipment. And in fact, there wasn't even a space allowed for technical maintenance or technical service. The technical services department was tucked away underneath the TV studio.
Okay.
The people just hadn't thought this through. Apparently all this stuff was just supposed to work.
Right.
And it obviously didn't. It needs maintenance and upkeep and so on. We built column speakers. Again, that's not something that was available off the shelf in those days. Not decent quality ones. So we had the carpenters make black columns and we mounted speakers in them, and that was the portable equipment. The amplifier, believe it or not, was dated from the 1950s.
Okay.
And I had the job of making this thing work. It's an old tube amp, and it had a record player mounted on top. And I just took the record player off and modified the amplifier, and that was actually basically our first portable PA system.
Okay.
Homemade speakers, homemade amplifier.
So that was kind of the complex of stuff that would be moved then into the cafeteria, the
Yes.
the mic,
And
the speakers and the
recorder.
the recorder.
Microphones were a problem.
Yeah.
The public address systems at the time had one standard and broadcasters had another. Never quite figured out why, but a number of stories as to why. If you look at a modern microphone, you'll see that the connector on the microphone is a male. The pins stick out. The socket in the wall is a female. For public address, for some reason, the socket in the wall was a male and the plug on the end of the microphone was a female. So we couldn't use professional microphones without having a little adapter. And a lot of the PA mics weren't up to broadcast standards, so they didn't necessarily match with the equipment. So a lot of modification was required. Things settled down in the mid-80s to the broadcast standard, but it took a while to get around these technical glitches.
So, just trying to sort of set the scene in some of the poetry readings, like when you would bring the equipment into the room and do the setup, because they were always on Friday nights, did you do that sort of in the afternoon or just prior? Or did you ever meet the poet earlier on in the day? Or
we did the setup earlier on, generally because it depended on the style that the poet wanted, the sort of setup that he wanted. Some were happy to stand at a podium, and therefore we could put a fixed mic on a stand. Others wanted to be able to wander around.
Also, you had discussions with the poets before,
or with the poet, and well, it was Howard Fink that was our contact.
Right.
I think it was Professor Hoffman was actually the name, but he showed up for the poetry readings. He never got involved in the actual organization. But Howard Fink would generally come with the poet and introduce the poet to one of us to find out what their needs were. And some just wanted a mic stand to stand up, some wanted a podium to put their poetry on, some liked to walk around. So you had to cater to the needs.
Right.
If it was a walk around, then you probably put a lavalier mic.
Oh yeah, that around
and if it was a podium reading, then it was pretty straightforward, just a stand.
Do you have any recollection of the different poets who did any different things? I do have a list of the poets. I don't know if that would.
Most of them are pretty standard, except for Bluebirds,
Right.
which was a audio extravaganza.
Okay, I'll just say that we were just talking before the interview started that Mark recalls sort of being there for the Jackson McLeod reading that involved a great variety of AV in itself. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about what that was. I mean, did he he alerted you to the fact that
he sent a letter to Howard Fink saying, I need the following equipment. And we looked at it and burst out laughing.
So
because
on there?
I imagine he was used to US universities with a lot more money than us, so we didn't have anywhere close to what he was looking for. He wanted recorders that could be, portable recorders that could be used and then played back during the sessions. And we didn't have any. We had a simple Sony, I don't remember the name, I think it was a 106 or something, reel-to-reel recorder that was used in classrooms for playbacks. So kind of a brown portable thing. Not particularly good quality. It took a cheapy mic, and that was basically it, but that's all we had.
Right.
So we used those, and we put them on carts and with a microphone, and then we took the outputs of all of these machines and fed them through a big matrix to feed back into the public address system.
Okay.
So that we'd be able to mix everything towards the end. And that was the setup, and it was a mess, and it probably wasn't what he was looking for, but I think it worked.
Mm-hmm.
There is a recording.
Mm-hmm.
I haven't heard it for many, many years, but he didn't seem to be unhappy about it, but it was certainly the most challenging of the readings, in my experience.
Oh yeah, it's really interesting too, yeah.
Yeah?
Mm-hmm. So, and any recollection of just sort of being in the room during that one? Was it?
I actually stayed around.
Was it a packed? I mean, did you usually stay around, or did that one sort of?
I usually stayed around to see that they got off to a
Mhm.
good start and made sure that the poet had all that they needed and make any adjustments and so on. But then left it up to the operator to
Mhm.
look after the session.
Mm-hmm.
That one, no, I stayed around because it does look so fascinating and it
Mhm.
was so fraught with crisis.
Oh,
And he spent his time rushing around the room.
wow.
I can't remember if we gave him a mic on a long cord or something,
Mm-hmm.
but he was rushing around the room giving the various students who were put, I don't know where they came from, maybe the English department, who had roles to repeat various clues that he gave them and then play them back at some point
Yeah.
in the reading. So
Yeah, I think they were called upon to kind of start reading at some point.
something like that. I don't remember quite what happened, but it was I guess he drew a big crowd.
Mm-hmm.
It was pretty packed and pretty chaotic,
Hmm.
and it was very participatory.
Oh, neat.
So it was kind of fun.
So that was, all the audience was milling about as well?
The audience was
Yeah.
also milling about, yes.
I also found a little piece of paper in the archive that referred to that reel, and it was addressed to Heather, which is Heather Dow, I believe, who apparently did some of the editing afterwards. But it said Heather, there's a steady hum on this tape. Again, the air conditioner. And I wondered if it had been the air conditioner or whether it was kind of sort of the result
I would
of all
imagine
this
there
other
was a lot
stuff.
of hum pickup from just
Yeah.
the massive wiring.
Yeah.
And the fact we were using mics which were all cheapy, unshielded, kind of off-the-shelf
And
mics.
And apparently he was also playing a film during the...
Oh, maybe.
Does that
I don't remember that,
well?
but that's
No,
quite
I'm not
likely.
sure either.
It's quite likely.
Okay.
Yeah, no, there was it was a cafeteria,
Yeah.
so air conditioning was a big problem, yes.
Okay.
And I guess it didn't really affect the recordings where the mic was very close to the reader,
Yeah.
but it certainly would have had an effect when you had maybe 10, 15 microphones open,
Wow. Yeah.
all connected together in a big mess.
Mm-hmm. So, did you? I mean, you brought up sort of your interaction with Howard Fink. Did you ever get a sense of what the purpose of the recordings was for, other than just to, have the tapes? Was there any talk about what they might be used for? Because we did end up finding that there were copies made. We
Yes.
found copies in the English department, and then I have a note where some were sent to the Norris libraries. So.
Non-print.
Mhm.
Oh no, I think that any event like that would have ended up as a resource in the non-print library.
Mhm.
I was heavily involved with the non-print library.
Okay.
Because a non-print could generally in libraries was really way down at the bottom of the list in terms of priorities.
Mhm.
But with a growing music department, things like the poetry readings, guest lecturers and guest lectures and video came in, of course. That material had to go somewhere.
Mhm.
It didn't make any sense leaving it with us because we couldn't get public access to it.
Right.
So it went to the library. And the department that had requested and therefore paid for the services got copies.
Okay.
These were generally paid for.
Yeah, that was another question I had.
We had to pay our staff.
Mhm.
Things were not free. We were only really supported to provide direct academic support in the classroom.
So this was considered sort of an
external event.
extracurricular.
Mhm.
Okay.
And probably had a grant to support it.
Right. Any recollection about what the cost might have been, or?
Yeah,
Sort
not
of.
true. No, I mean, it was basically the cost of the part-timer plus some sort of nominal rental fee for the equipment.
Mhm. Or the tapes, or.
Yeah, it was, whoever did bookings.
Right.
We had, it was like you just read the prices off the list.
Mm-hmm.
That was it. I don't remember what they were.
So, after you did do the recordings, what was the process with the tapes? Because I know sometimes they were, I mean, were they edited or gone through back at the lab?
We'd been in the lab, yes. They were topped and tailed.
Okay.
And some of them I think ended up probably being 2 reels. It was a long session. Depends which machine was being used. If it was the Crown or the Reeboks, then we were using 10-inch reels.
Mm-hmm.
So you didn't need to stop. If it was a Ewer, of course, you ended up with maybe 4 reels.
Mm-hmm.
So that was a bit of a constraint. So there were pieces missing probably.
Okay.
And yes, somebody would have topped and tailed them and put leaders and made a copy for the library and put labels on the boxes and so forth.
And was that the procedure kind of for any tape, like poetry recordings or other lectures or music, to always make a copy? So master and or
I guess so. If it was
depending on
a sponsored event, yes, we'd make a copy and one would go to the library and one would have gone to the sponsor. No, pretty well.
Yeah.
Because I think the whole object of recording an event was to make it publicly
Right.
accessible.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't just for somebody to stick on their shelf.
No. Any thought about, or was there any discussion about trying to make a series for sale? Or I found some memos from Bernard Queenan's time that were sort of talking about, I think maybe the CIT was in a more of a crisis time. I got the sense from the memo sort of where he's talking about, ways of maybe selling some of the
yes.
stuff.
Well,
sort of-
we're always in a crisis.
Yeah.
The AV services was not considered a very high priority.
Mm-hmm.
But we did have a lot of freedom. And summertime was quiet.
Yeah.
And there were a lot of services for which we could charge. So in actual fact, we were semi-private. We actually had a commercial side. And we did quite a lot of external productions. At one point, I think the height of our of that side of our operation, I think we were bringing in about $250,000 a year in external revenues.
What was that late, sort of, can you put a year on that, sort of?
The high
80s
point,
or-
late 80s, early 90s
Okay.
was the time at the highest.
Mm-hmm.
And some of those were quite prestigious and innovative external projects. We couldn't compete with commercial providers
Mm-hmm.
because that would have got us into trouble, but we could do stuff that nobody else could handle.
Yeah.
And we had the edge because we were an academic institution and we had a lot of researchers and expertise within the university that could actually do this kind of thing. One of our most innovative projects was for Bell Telephone. And when the Centrex phone system was introduced, which was quite innovative in terms of what you now accept with the various calling services that you now have on your phone, the various bells and whistles that you can add. When that was first introduced, people had a really hard time understanding how they could do three-way conferencing and how they could link stuff, how they could leave messages, how they could retrieve messages, how they could forward calls, all this sort of business. We built a mock phone exchange to represent what would happen if you actually called on the phone system, and had videos which were on 12-inch video disc of various scenarios. And this was used for training. You could actually sit down at a computer screen,
Right.
and you had a real phone as the interface, and whatever you did on there appeared on the screen. And you could call people and leave messages and retrieve messages and go into conference calling and all of that. And we hired actors to act the little scenarios, and it was quite humorous. And the technical side was really quite innovative. It was done by Concordia simply because, as the engineers of Bell explained, it would have cost them about 10 times as much, just because of their corporate structure of doing something and then setting it for approval, and then doing something else and setting it for approval. There were 2 people in the technical services division who just set their mind to building a repro or a sort of a model of a phone exchange. And it's just the beginning of the highly sophisticated integrated circuit, and there's a thing called an EEPROM, which was a programmable chip. And they actually sat there and programmed these things from scratch. And this was all using machine language. There was no interface. This was all very primary computer programming.
So what year was that?
I would think about 86 or something.
Okay. Right.
And that was pretty innovative.
So a lot of innovating and a lot of kind of do-it-yourself.
A lot of do-it-yourself, a lot of innovative stuff, and it earned a lot of money.
Yeah.
And that was really good because we could plow that back into the operation of the department.
Interesting. I want to kind of maybe ask or follow up on what you said about sort of the tape library, just because one of the aspects that we're trying to fill in around the poetry series, and because its focus is on sound recording, trying to get a sense of how faculty and students interacted with sound recording at that time. For instance, whether it was, kind of, out, like whether people sort of were familiar with reel-to-reel recording and tape decks and stuff like that. Because I've seen that those pieces of equipment were available to borrow. Mm-hmm. And also I know from certain videos and other things I've read that the CIT and Instructional Media Office were, part of the mandate was to make things with faculty and assist, and also to train students in how to use this stuff. So I'm wondering, with kind of like the enthusiasm for television, whether sound recording was kind of neglected, or whether people were into that outside of or off campus, or do you have any thoughts about?
Well, everybody wanted to do TV,
okay,
of course, but that wasn't necessarily that easy. Mm-hmm. Sound was much simpler. Did students use sound equipment? I think they did in their presentations. Mm-hmm. Certainly a lot was borrowed. We had, there was no sound studio designed for the whole building when it was opened.
There wasn't?
There was no sound studio, just a big television studio. Yeah. And that was one of the first things that I got involved in.
So where was the topping and tailing done?
In the language lab.
Oh, okay, so.
They had the basic editing equipment because they had to prepare the tapes for. And if you want, there's a little bit of history on the language labs.
Yeah, I love it.
Okay, in the days of the building on Drummond Street, mm-hmm. the language lab was owned and operated by the French department. Mm-hmm. And so there tended to be specialized resources actually run by the academic department, to which they were important. Mm-hmm. When the whole building was opened, the concept was to have a central service area. Now, many academic departments didn't like this particularly because they lost control.
Right, okay.
But on the other hand, if we provided good service, then in fact, after a while, they very quickly realized it was a lot easier to have a third party to run the services for them, rather than them trying to do it themselves, which meant having staff supervising and all of that sort of business. Mm-hmm. And also they can complain and blame somebody else if anything went wrong.
Right.
The original language labs, I think, were made by Viking.
Okay.
And basically every student position had a tape recorder, mm-hmm. which was backwards. The take-up reel was on the left, the main spool was on the right. Why, I don't know, and I'm trying to remember if the heads were actually reversed so that the oxide was on the outside.
Was this like a tape recorder you could pick up, or was it built into the
mounted
table?
Into the console.
Mounted into it.
Mounted in the console, and a pair of headphones. So you went in there, took a tape off the shelf if you wanted to do an exercise, and you could stick it on the machine and you could do it yourself.
And these were compact cassettes?
No,
the reel-to-reel.
Okay,
so they're
very bad
self-serve.
scene. Didn't work that well. The operation actually was organized around scheduling classes in for their language lab at specific hours. And then an operator would sit at the main console and put the master tape on. Right. And everybody was ready, went clunk, and you played the master tape. And the students could then answer, and the local decks were then recorders. Mm-hmm. And they were actually arranged, they were voice activated, so that when the student spoke, the machine started, and well, actually, when there was a little beep, I was right, on the master tape there was a little beep, which activated the